So today we're transitioning from the first part of the class where we reviewed a lot of information on different research findings related to environment and behavior, people's transactions with their settings. And we're turning now to how do you translate all of that work and all of those interesting findings into guidelines for improving community environments, whether that be a classroom, a dormitory, a workplace, a residence hall, what have you. So if we go to the next slide, what we have here is really a toolbox of principles and findings from the field of environmental psychology. And when you think about it, you guys have learned a lot because you've covered everything from systems theory and social ecology to ecosystems, person-environment fit, congruence, environmental symbolism, determinism, physiological stress, psychological stress, density crowding, spatial behavior, proximity and friendship formation, intimacy gradients, defensible space. So all of these, place identity, operant reinforcement schedules, human response to natural technological disasters, pro-environmental behavior. There's a lot there that we've covered and that you've learned about. And now the question is, how can we apply these to designing better cities or designing better classrooms or other kinds of environments? So we're going to see today how some designers and urban theorists have developed principles of design. Some of them are based on empirical evidence, but many of these designers we're talking about here come out of their intuition. And interestingly, some of the designers focus on the negative aspects of cities and want to avoid density at all costs. And another group of designers are very favorable to density. So we're going to see some interesting examples of that. Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, emphasized organic architecture and viewed large cities as almost tumors or clots in an organismic system that were inimical to health and well-being. Ebenezer Howard, the English theorist, focused on the garden city, getting out of London and industrialized urban centers in England to more rural, comfortable garden cities. Lewis Mumford, The Culture of Cities, Duane and Katz, The New Urbanism, which you read about today. There's an article by them. And even Ray Watson, the first president of the Irvine Company, these were all decentrists. They wanted to spread the population out. They weren't big on vertical architecture. They liked rural environments, a lot of nature. So we'll see some of these examples today. So here you've got Frank Lloyd Wright's perspective on cities. And he says that to look at the cross-section of a large city is to look at something like a fibrous tumor. Not only are there similar exaggerations of inflamed tissue, but more and more painfully forced circulation, comparable to high blood pressure in the human system. He said that ultimate human satisfactions no longer depend on, but are destroyed by density of population. Skyscraping is not merely a falsity, but a moral, economic, aesthetic, and ethical monstrosity. So it's like, Frank, tell us how you really feel about cities. He was really down on large cities, urban centers, high density. And if you read his article, I assigned it because the writing is so colorful, I think you'll find it pretty interesting in terms of how he expresses his philosophy. But very extreme, anti-urban kind of sentiment. And let's take a look at we're going to show a clip from a TV program. I don't know if it's still on the air, but it sort of captures Frank Lloyd Wright's negative view of large cities. All right, so, you've got the garbage on the street, you've got bodies on the street. It's all the kind of negative things we think about with cities. And when we talk about Frank Lloyd Wright's reaction to that, he had an antidote or an alternative. He called it organic architecture. And organic architecture is environmental design that blends harmoniously rather than conflicts with the surrounding natural landscape. So just like this project here, Falling Water, he built it to conform and blend with the contours of the water, the trees, the stones in that area. And it's almost camouflaged to the extent that it blends in so well. So these are a couple of examples of his work. And even in Irvine, we have this Falling Water Irvine, which is across the street of Wholesome Choice Market on Michelson Drive. How many of you have seen this house? Any of you seen it? Okay. So it sort of recapitulates some of Frank Lloyd Wright's elements with the water here and the kind of natural colors of the stone. But it's in a strange place because it's right at the intersection. It's right up against the Michelson Drive where you have a shopping center, a busy shopping center across the street. So it doesn't quite fit the same way that Falling Water that Frank Lloyd Wright designed fits beautifully into the surrounding landscape. We're going to show a brief documentary about Falling Water just to give you a little more flavor of what Frank Lloyd Wright was talking about when he expressed these views about organic architecture.
Falling Water has been called Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpiece of organic architecture, and I think there are a variety of reasons why. Certainly one of them is that it, perhaps better than any of his other buildings, speaks to something deep within us that longs for simplicity, unity, all of those things we find in nature and respond to so well. In 1938, when the building first took shape and publicity started to be generated around it, it appears on the cover of Time magazine. And it's very obvious that the public is captivated by the building. I don't think they had seen anything quite like it. It was daring, it was dramatic, all of those things which capture our imagination.
Today, Falling Water is memorable, considered significant, as a great landmark in architectural design around the world. It represents a great architect working at the height of his design powers, and thus, is significant as an object in its own right. But for even people who don't think about the career of Frank Lloyd Wright, or that this is a masterwork of a particular time, the building is meaningful and powerful as, again, an experience of Wright's organic architecture, of where there is a remarkable continuity of all the factors that go in the making and experience of a building. Continuities of space, continuities of materials, continuity of connection to the site, the profound sense of being somewhere. These are qualities that students of architecture today, architects, just general members of the public, experience and leave the house with a sort of an awareness of the potential for good design.
A masterpiece is something that has a timelessness about it, and I think Falling Water is doing well over the test of time. People continue to be interested in it. A wide array of people are interested in it. A masterpiece is something that you continue to learn from, and we do continue to learn from Falling Water.
Later in the course, we'll be talking about research on the effect of people's exposure to nature, whether that be gardens near their home or going out on wilderness experiences, as that relates to their stress experiences, their sense of relaxation, their sense of restoration. And Frank Lloyd Wright was not going from that research. He intuited a lot of the benefits of nature and built that into his design. And we'll see later that a lot of research sort of bears out his assumptions and supports what he was talking about. And yet at the same time, we're going to look at pro-density or centrist designers and look at the kinds of guidelines they've come up with and why they think cities would be a better alternative than living out in a rural area like this. So sometimes design guidelines are not necessarily complementary, and you can think of particular places that have conflicting design guidelines. So if you think of the Geary Concert Center in Los Angeles, that beautiful new concert hall that was built there, the musicians have one set of needs for acoustics in terms of when they're doing their musical performance. The pedestrians that are walking near that building have another set of needs relative to the car traffic. And then the people that live in apartment buildings adjacent to that neighborhood have another set of needs and guidelines because they found that the roof of that concert hall reflected so much sunlight into their buildings that the temperature went up 15 degrees, and they had to retrofit the roof of that concert hall in order to get rid of that problem. So it's interesting that design guidelines don't always go in the same direction. Sometimes they're contradictory. So we have our pro-rural, anti-density designers, and then we're going to see a whole group of people that are heralding the city as the only place to live. But staying on point with the anti-density designers, these are some examples from Ebenezer Howard's drawings of his garden city. And the garden city that he envisioned was modeled after the English country town. So it was getting people out of the industrialized centers in England into these clean, hospitable, safe, rural environments that he called the garden city. Wholesome housing. He had a big emphasis on providing people with high-quality, wholesome housing. He emphasized gardens. These sort of curlicue shapes here are gardens that ring the whole city. So just as in Irvine we talk about green belts, because the Irvine planners borrowed many of these ideas about garden cities and incorporated them into the town of Irvine when it was first designed. And population was held at a ceiling of 32,000 because he didn't want to have the problems associated with high density. In this slide, you see some of those same themes where you look here beyond the concentric rings and the green belts and the housing, and you see all of these rural uses, the cow pastures and the fruit farms, and all of this is that bucolic ideal of living out in the country. And here what you see is the kind of hierarchical relationship between the smaller garden cities of 32,000 people connected through rail lines and high-speed roads to central cities that had up to 58,000 people. So just as we read in New Urbanism today by Katz and Duani, the Katz article about transit-oriented design, how you can have a new urbanist community built along rail routes that connect it to higher density centers. This hierarchical notion was a precursor of New Urbanism. So this is an example of how the garden ideal has been incorporated into the planning of Irvine's residential villages, where these pathways lined with trees and gardens sort of meander through the neighborhood and behind the houses, which is fairly unusual. You don't see too much of that anymore in tract house developments because it's fairly expensive to put that amount of investment into nature. And when you go into low-income communities, you certainly don't see this kind of flavor. You have much more concrete, much less natural elements. And it turns out that nature adjacent to one's home has a stress buffering effect, and that's been documented in children, and especially so in low-income areas, where you compare low-income areas that have a lot of nature and less nature. So when we talk about new urbanism as sort of growing out of the garden city ideal, this is a very popular trend in urban planning theory today. And it's predicated on certain principles that you want to design highly compact, walkable communities. Ideally, they should be walkable across the diameter of the community in 5 minutes or less, which is a fairly small community. And it's hard to do that unless you're starting from scratch. You know, in Irvine, the planners started from scratch and they built a new town. And it takes a lot of resource to do that. And in this day and age, with the budget shortfalls that we have, there's not a lot of development of these types of new urbanist towns from scratch. So what happens is you have new urbanist infills or renovations, redevelopment in large cities where you take a neighborhood and you try to make it more new urbanist. But in addition to the walkability and the compactness and the kind of clearly defined center where you have the civic buildings here located so people can see them and identify with them, so there's kind of a symbolic value to having those symbols very evident. It sort of brings the community together more. A lot of emphasis on parks and public places where people can congregate, socio-optimal settings where people can get together. So these are some of the key principles that are laid out in this book on New Urbanism. And if you go to the Congress of New Urbanism website, you can see some of the more recent research that's been done in this, out of this particular paradigm. This is an example of New Urbanist kinds of principles where you have human scale design. The buildings are only 2 stories high. You have wide sidewalks, a lot of street trees. You have interesting textures, changes in textures, different parts of the building, and you have these different colors to make it a more interesting, vibrant sort of visual experience walking down that street. So it's more accessible to pedestrians than would be the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles, which we'll see a little bit later. Now, would Irvine be considered a new urbanist town? What do you think? Why? Anybody? Yeah. So you have to drive. It's pretty spread out from the north to the south. What's your name? Jess. Jess? Okay. And so you've got the walkability in 5 minutes. No, it doesn't really meet that standard. Is the Civic Center centrally located? How many of you have seen the Irvine Civic Center? Okay, that's a pretty good number. It's actually out there on Harvard and Alton, I believe. So it's not sort of on the beaten path in a sense. You kind of have to know where it is to get to a city meeting. Is Irvine diverse in its use of land? Are there a lot of different kind of land uses? What do you think about that? Yeah, that's been a struggle in Irvine. When they first designed the marketplace across from UCI, the plan was to have mixed-use housing. So you'd have housing on top of the shops. So you'd have maybe some people living above the restaurants or even the movie theaters. Probably not the movie theaters, but maybe some of the restaurants and stores. And that was taken out of the plan because it was too sort of avant-garde, too advanced at that time. It didn't appeal to enough vendors who wanted to rent from the Irvine Company in the marketplace. So they had to go with less mixture of uses and much more retail. But many cities have that kind of mixed land use, and you can see that in a lot of towns where they mix up the housing and the retail spaces in the same block. And that gets back to what Jane Jacobs argues are an important factor that makes cities work. When you have that diversity of land uses, that brings different kinds of people into the same area at different times of day. So you have a more even use of the space. You have what she calls eyes on the street. So even though people don't know each other personally, people can recognize if a stranger doesn't belong in that area. So there are people sort of surveilling the place because of the natural flows of activity. Sean? Yeah, so if you have a place that's only open certain hours of the day and very few hours of the night, that leaves a lot of places undefended or unwatched. So in the kinds of spaces in New York that Jane Jacobs is talking about as being vibrant urban centers, you have this flow of use all day. So you've got people going away from their apartments during the day to go to work, other people coming in for their work or recreation, people coming home at night, or people coming in from other areas for recreational places that are open at night. So you have a much more of an even use of the space. Maybe you have a jazz place on that block or a music place or a coffee shop that's open late to bring a lot of different people in at different times of day. That makes it a safer environment. Charles? Yeah, it's interesting what Charles is saying, that Irvine has such a new prefabricated kind of look. How can people kind of bond with it and feel that it has a timeless quality? And interestingly, when this building was designed, I was actually sitting in on the design committee reviews. And one of the things that the architectural firm emphasized and sold the plan on was that by having this clock tower and having this granite material that's very solid and stable, they were arguing that this gave the building a kind of timeless quality, that people could see it as an enduring part of their community. So interesting take on the design. But it is sort of isolated out there in a tract neighborhood. So it's not like in New Urbanism where you have it in the middle of a central park or place where people are gathering. So generally, Irvine would not qualify in terms of the compactness criteria of New Urbanism. Certainly, there's easy access to a lot of parks and ball fields and some public places like shopping malls. But other than the shopping centers, there's not a lot of public places going on. So not so much in terms of New Urbanism. Now let's take a look at some of the pro-density designers, because there are designers who built their whole career on promoting verticality and promoting people living in cultural centers where you had enough people congregated that you could have culture and you could have excitement and avant-garde advances, whether that be in art or in science. So Corbusier is one of the exemplars of this pro-density movement. He's a French architect, worked a lot in the 30s at the height of his career, and his designs actually were the forerunner of buildings like the capital of Brazil, Brasilia. Many of the buildings there are based on Le Corbusier's principles, and he was a consultant on the design of the Brazilian capital. The World Trade Center, even the Pruitt-Igoe buildings that we talked about, the high-rise kind of idea where you don't have much of a footprint on the ground, but you have people going up high, very much came out of his ideas. Jane Jacobs was not so much pushing verticality, but rather, if we're going to have cities, and you compare cities that work well and cities that are sort of dismal, like that NYPD Blue segment, what differentiates the cities that work well and those that don't? So what do you think about that? What do you think in Jacobs' theory makes a city vibrant or makes it livable or a nice place to be? Sort of what are her requirements to have a good city or a vital, safe urban area? Sean?
Lots of stores in the street front, wider sidewalks, mixed residential land uses, eyes on the street in the sense that you need stores open all night, certain times of the night. So like you might have like a restaurant and a retail space selling other stuff and then maybe a bar.
Okay.
Throughout the night.
So when you read Jane Jacobs' article, I'm going to show you a slide that says generators of diversity, and there are 4 key points that she makes. One of the ways people ask, how should you study in this class and how do you go through the readings? There's a lot of reading, I agree. One thing you could do is before class, go through the readings quickly and scan them in terms of what are the topics, what are the key points being discussed. Then, after lecture and after you have the slides, take a look at some of the key points that have been highlighted in lectures, and then go find them back in the readings. And you'll see, okay, Jane Jacobs, that's where she's talking about these generators of diversity. Or this is where Katz and Kahn are talking about their principles of systems theory. And that's how we try to key on sort of what are the main points or the critical points we want you to get from these readings, because admittedly there is a lot of material to cover. And you saw from that toolbox of principles that I put up, we've been over a lot of ground. We've covered a lot of different concepts, terminology, so it's a lot to absorb and assimilate. So Paulo Soleri is another guy who is very pro-density and pro-urban. He coined the term arcology, which is the fusion of ecology and architecture. And he saw buildings and cities as organic systems, as almost living entities that had cubic structure, so he tended to go higher with his buildings. They had multiple levels for the different functions of the city, just like individuals and organisms have sort of specialized functions in different parts of the body. So he drew on a lot of those sort of organic principles in his high-density designs. And we'll see some examples of those. And finally, Kenzo Tange, who is a famous Japanese high-density designer, and he had a very elaborate plan for building Tokyo out onto Tokyo Bay so you could get more people in that area by building out over the water. Never quite happened that way, but his designs caught a lot of attention and were heralded as being pretty advanced. So here's Corbusier, and one of his major elements is geometrically placed skyscrapers. So he's got these, nicely arranged, almost like a Rector set of buildings. Each would house about 1,200 residents. Sometimes you had gardens at the tops on the roofs, so he was sort of a precursor of the green roof movement, which we talked about earlier in the class. And the advantage he saw of building this way is that the skyscrapers would only take up about 5% of the ground space, so you could be efficient with how the resources on the ground are used. And also he would elevate or build the streets underground so that they weren't in pedestrians' way. So pedestrians could walk around in here because the streets were either elevated or underground. So these were how he would take the edge off of high density. He would build high, vertical. You'd have all the benefits of people being clustered together, high culture, but you wouldn't have all the problems of density because of the rooftop gardens that would take some of the pressure off and the way the street system was designed. And these are some examples where his principles have been applied, actually translated into urban design here in the capital of Brazil. And also, if you go into modern Beijing these days, you see a lot of emphasis on replacing low-rise residential structures, Hutong neighborhoods, for example, with these high-rise apartment buildings that house hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. This is Kenzo Tange's plan for building Tokyo out over Tokyo Bay. So this didn't really get designed, but that was his idea of being able to encompass even more millions of people in the Tokyo region by building out over the water. So all of these designers are really big on high density. They felt that large cities and dense urban conglomerations yielded a lot of good things, such as people having a diversity of options. You know, if you want to go to this play or this movie or go to this art museum, you had all of that at your disposal. This is an example of Paulo Solari, his design of this sort of organic structure, a city, a community that was enclosed in a solid skin. And you can see how it's not taking up a big footprint on the ground, but instead uses this cubic space where you've got the residential spaces up at top here, and you've got some of the working spaces down here below. And so you've got these different areas or functions of the community housed on different levels. And here you've got natural light coming in through a light well. So integrating architecture and ecology and emphasizing efficient use of resources by not taking up too much ground space. And so he designed this demonstration community called Arcosanti in Arizona. How many of you have been to Arcosanti? Any of you been there? Or some of you may have these bells that they produce in Arcosanti, and that's one of the ways they make their money to be able to do some of these things. They're pretty popular. If you go on the website, you can order those. And these are some of the buildings that have actually been constructed at Arcosanti. This is sort of the People's Hall up here, this nicely designed roof. This is the entrance to Arcosanti. So Sean mentioned these generators of diversity that Jane Jacobs talks about, so I want to just recap those real quick. For her, high density ensures that you're and combining high density with mixed building types or land uses ensures that you're going to get diversity of people using the space most hours of the day so that they can see each other. The place is inhabited, it's used, and it's less likely to have crime that way because places aren't left vacant. So that was a big principle in her design. Also, cutting up city blocks into short parcels rather than having these long monolithic blocks where people can be a stranger, and someone can be a stranger and nobody knows whether they belong to a store there or an apartment building or whatever. When you have shorter blocks, more compact neighborhoods or block structure, people can identify each other a little better. And it creates a more sort of vibrant use of the space. So these are all, mixture of building types and land uses, the short city blocks, the density, all combined to make that space in cities in New York particularly livable and enjoyable. Not all areas in New York are like that. She's saying some that have these qualities qualify as being highly diverse and very livable. These are some ways in which this happens in the traditional courtyard homes in Beijing, where you have these low-rise neighborhoods, and you've got the street trees, you've got vendors, you've got largely pedestrian and bike traffic with some cars, not a lot. So the walkability is high. And when you compare that to what's happening along the ring roads, where you have these monolithic skyscrapers, you can see that the scale, somebody walking around in here has a very different scale and experience than if they're walking here and the environment is more scaled to their dimensions as a pedestrian. So these environments tend to be a little bit more overwhelming and difficult to kind of relate to, even though they have their economic advantages for sure. Human scale, I've used this term a couple times. So what does that mean exactly? And in the city of Seattle and in other places, they've tried to define that fairly precisely so that people know what's meant when they use that term. sizes, textures, and arrangements of physical elements that match the size and proportions of humans and can be perceived easily at walking speed. So there's an emphasis on pedestrians being the measure of environmental quality. As soon as you get people going fast through an environment in a car, they miss so much of what's going on, and they can't sort of relate to that environment as closely or as comfortably. So here in Seattle, you have these treatments of the environment where you've got these textures on the building, very different kind of windows and colors, and the pedestrian activities down below. And then over here, you've got this overhang, which is very ornate in its design, and then the textured pavement. Anything you can do to break up monotony and bring in texture makes the environment much better scaled to pedestrians' needs. Now, these are factors that contribute to human scale, and while I'm showing you these, I would like you to think about, well, what are factors that detract from human scale? What would be an environment that really doesn't have very good human scale at all, or would be kind of inimical to pedestrians using it? So clearly, if you have environments that have buildings with a lot of details, like I showed you where they have the different textures at different heights, you have street trees that humanizes the environment, makes it more scaled to individuals walking through the space, and you know, ample landscaping, textures in the pavement. Remember, I showed you the examples in some of the housing apartment areas where they use colored asphalt to tie the secondary spaces to the private spaces. So using that texturing, even in the ground, street furniture, making it easy for people to sit and be comfortable so that they don't have to stand completely when they're in that space. And mixed land uses in third places. So we're going to talk about what is a third place and what does it mean to have a mixture or diversity of third places. So what would be places that sort of undermine human scale? Yeah. So, yeah, some of these buildings that have monotonous facades, there's no doors, there's no windows, no decorations, no texture, those are kind of stultifying, not very pleasant environments to be in. So first, some examples of how these principles that promote human scale. Let's take a look at a few examples of that. Here you've got this Plaza Mayor in Madrid, where even though you're going above a couple of stories here, 4 or 5 at most, you've got a very nice design motif going on with a lot of texturing, a lot of diversity with these towers here and the fine detail on the rails and the window elements. And then on the ground level, you've got the textured pavement. You've got a lot of areas for pedestrians to stop and, you know, get coffee, something like that. So St. Mark's Plaza in Venice is a great example of that same kind of scale in a large public space. And you don't find these kind of public spaces so much in Irvine or places that have been planned from scratch, right? And that's one of the things that people miss in Irvine. This is a library building here at the University of Mexico, and you can see the incredibly detailed artwork, tile work that's gone into the facade of that building. And that, combined with the pattern here of the grass and the walkways, creates a kind of textured feel to that place. It makes it a little bit more human scale, even though this is a very huge structure. Here in in Florence, you've got Brunelleschi's Dome, highly detailed architectural treatments, the French Quarter in New Orleans, this row house in San Francisco, where you've got a lot of detail on the side of the house and the window dressings, and all of that sort of makes for a kind of a diverse visual experience, nicely scaled. So, features that really work against human scale, and this comes out in the Gell and Gemzo article. So when you read that article and you think about this slide, there are things like, Charles mentioned monotonous facades. The building here, Social Science Tower on our campus, is one of those kind of monotonous facades. It's kind of a high-rise building, but a lot of concrete, not a lot of interesting details on the side. I might have mentioned that building was used in one of the Planet of the Apes movies. The apes were crawling up the side of the Social Science Tower. So this campus has been used many times as a movie set, but not the most human scale kind of building. And in fact, when the campus was designed, the inner circle by the original designers had these very large concrete monolithic structures and not very pleasant to students. And that's the kind of thing that Robert Summer was reacting to when he came here and then published his book Tight Spaces and called out our engineering building and a lot of other buildings for lacking human scale. Large units with few or no doors, no visible variation in function, passive facades that don't invite people in or to be active, but rather sort of keep them out. Lack of detail, nothing interesting to look at. So all of these kind of factors really downplay and hurt human scale. And I'm sure you can think of other environments that are like that. So the Bonaventure Hotel, how many of you have visited the Bonaventure Hotel? Okay, a few of you have. And what did you find? Aya, any comments about, any reflections on that place? Uh-huh. Yeah, when you go into it, it's not a bad-looking place. They've got water elements, kind of cool elevator things, and there's a lot of nice human space inside. The problem with that structure is outside. It's the scaling of these towers of the hotel to the freeways. It's very good scaling to our freeway system, but not very good for these pedestrians down here that are walking along these massive concrete facades with not a lot of entry points. I mean, you get to the hotel entrance, you can go in, but there's not a lot to do or see around the perimeter of that hotel. It's just a lot of traffic. And in fact, people can walk there if they're elevated. They have these passageways over the freeways. But other than that, it's a very high traffic environment. So the outside is not human scale at all. And that's what Gell and Gemzo refer to as monotonous facades, passive facades. In the reading by Edward Hall, he talks about the automobile syndrome. And certainly the Bonaventure Hotel shows how many of our buildings have to be sited conveniently to freeway on-ramps and exits. And we have this sort of fixation on using our cars as opposed to what he calls the kinesthetic sense of space. You've got the visual experience of space when you're zooming through an environment on a freeway, and you can observe broadly the contours of the place visually, but you can't really take in a lot of these details through multiple senses like sound, sight, what the place smells like, what it feels like. So these are fine-grained details of an environment when you walk through it, and that's called kinesthetic sense. And if you ever go into physical therapy and people have a knee injury or something, and the therapist is trying to get them to regain their sense of kinesthetic balance, that's what they're talking about, where they're able to sense the different feels and textures of the environment so they can maintain their balance. So that's what he's talking about there. And he's really criticizing a lot of American cities for being so focused on automobile traffic. And that's what the new urbanists were saying too. Let's get rid of a lot of that traffic, make cities more compact and walkable so we're not so dependent on cars that are polluting and that sort of detach us and alienate us from the scale of our environments. So before we take a break here, I want you to do one other thing. Take your piece of paper and interview one person. They could be sitting next to you, behind you, and I'd like you to ask them what place in Irvine, what are the places in Irvine that have been left out? What's not here that should be here? Whether it's a third place or some other kind of setting, what's missing from Irvine? So just ask your neighbor and write down what your neighbor says. Okay, so you guys should have your interviews done. And just for starters, any examples, ideas about what's missing from Irvine? Yeah. So Irvine's lacking a downtown area where people can congregate and just hang out. It's not Joe. Yeah. Samantha. What? Nightlife, nightclubs, place. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Even the Improv, that comedy place that used to be here, moved over to the Spectrum. Yeah, what's your name? Eats? A zoo. Okay, that's true. No zoo. We could use a zoo. So remember I said when we were talking about behavior settings, Roger Barker's idea of places that have physical milieus and behavioral programs, and they have a kind of a recurring quality like classes or teams. We said that behavior settings are the building blocks of communities, and the composition of those behavior settings, their diversity, and whether they appeal to different age groups or different ethnicities or different lifestyles is what gives a community its flavor, its character, its ambiance. So Ray Oldenburg, an urban planning theorist, picked up on this idea and went a little further than just the behavior setting, and he said, well, there are different categories of behavior settings. First places, which are sort of home and family environments. Second places, which are work and school, where you have to put out a lot of effort and do your work. And third places, which were the kind of linchpin of his theory, were these nice informal places where people could hang out with strangers or with friends and relax. So they get away from the stresses of home and work, the first and second places. So he said that, places that lacked these third place settings were bad places to live in. They didn't have any human scale. So for him, human scale wasn't just about the physical dimensions of scale and kinesthetic sense, having more kinesthetic sense of a place, but also having diversity of options. So big cities have a lot of different places you can go to, and recreational environments and sports environments and teams and all of that. And a lot of suburban places don't have all that diversity. So how do we build third places into our communities to make them interesting? So that's what these books are about. This one lays out his theory, The Great Good Place. And then this book is case studies. It's several case studies of how communities have created interesting, vibrant third places. So this is his basic definition. And when you read the selection from his book, definitely look for, how he describes and gives examples of these different categories, the first, second, and third places. And that's really been kind of one of his main contributions. Here you see his kind of definition of third places: core settings of informal public life, variety of public spaces that host the regular, voluntary, informal, and happily anticipated gatherings of individuals beyond the realms of home and work. So whether we're talking about a high-density city with millions of people or a place like Irvine, he's saying all of these different sizes of communities need third places for diversity to make it an interesting place. So many of you identified places that are missing from Irvine that make it less interesting. And wouldn't it be nice if some of these things could be added back in? Now, we do have our third places. We don't have a lot of them, but this is an example of one that's highly valued by residents and even visitors. So you can see this every Saturday at the UCI Marketplace. People come here, they say it's one of the best farmers markets in all of Southern California in terms of the variety of foods, the friendliness of the people. People will go into a lot of detail about how they grew a vegetable. And, the variety is crazy. People seem to really care about what they're selling. You can ask people questions, get a carefully thought out, educated response. This guy is amazing. His avocados, and he'll tell you about them. If you like Mediterranean food, you have to try this dip. So, these are taken off of the web, comments about going to the farmer's market and why people like it and how that sort of creates more community. It creates more scale, and it creates a third place where people can get together in ways that are different than if they're at home or at work. So how many of you have been to this bookstore in Denver called the Tattered Cover? Charles, what's your impression of the Tattered Cover?
It's extremely cool.
Charles says it's a really cool bookstore.
Yeah, it just has a lot of personality. It's laid out well, and it feels very much personal. When you walk in there, you feel like it's your bookstore in a sense that there's just tons of choices. You don't feel like that you are limited to what's the bestseller at the time or something.
Okay, so tons of choices, where to sit, what to look at, a lot of visual variety. It's very welcoming. People don't get kicked out after a couple hours if they're sitting there and maybe fall asleep on the couch or they're reading a book. It's very welcoming to people of all ages, all denominations. So it's kind of I think a treasured place in Denver, actually. And I'm going to show you a little video. And here I'm going to exploit my son again, who's a TV reporter. But he actually did a report on the closing of one of the Tattered Cover bookstores in Denver. Not the main one downtown, but the one in Cherry Creek. And I just want to show this to you because I think it captures how people feel, their emotional attachment to that particular setting.
Stockles is live at the store in Cherry Creek tonight, where a small army of volunteers is busy packing up, and that is a big store, so I'm sure they're busy.
Yeah, Vida, a small army indeed. You've never seen the store looking quite like it does now. There are about 200 or so people here, volunteers, and they've got to move about 100,000 books before tomorrow, by Monday morning. Now, of course, it's not every store out there that's going to inspire such loyalty amongst its customers that they'd actually show up and volunteer to help them move. But these people say they wanted to be here tonight because they say this store has been there for them for the last 35 years.
Last day, huh?
Yeah.
I hate to see this store close. I'll miss you.
I grew up practically here. Thank you. It makes me go.
One last Saturday at the Tattered Cover.
There is a lot of nostalgia for the store, and each person brings their own story to it.
For 35 years they've come, couples out of habit.
Saturday, right? This kind of a tradition.
A single mom out of need.
On Sundays, that used to be my getaway time. Have a chance to listen to grown-ups talking.
Generations of book lovers all drawn to this clean, well-lighted place.
It's easy to strike up a conversation with people you don't even know.
Oh, I'm going to miss it being
Today, they came to say goodbye.
God bless you.
Somehow, over the years, owner Joyce Meskis
We're ready.
made this huge store a home, a part of the neighborhood.
Thank you.
When you lose something like this, the neighborhood changes a little bit.
It has always been an important part of people's lives, worthy of applause and even tears as registers rang for the last time.
Hey, you're all set.
When I met my husband in the store, we've got a lot of memories in the store.
But the real story is the customers and the books. Without those, the Tattered Cover does not exist.
And I'm told that 3 customers actually came from out of state just to be here on this, the final day for the Tattered Cover here in Cherry Creek. And a lot of the things in this store that are so recognizable, these old brown bookshelves, the green carpet that you see on the floor, a lot of those touches you will find in the new store in the Lowenstein Theater up on Colfax Avenue. They're set to open with a big ribbon cutting right around 8 a.m. on Monday. Guys, back to you.
All right, so this was a few years ago that he did that report, and I hadn't talked to him about third places, but he happened to do this report because it was closing, and it seemed to fit so well the emotional appeal of certain kinds of third places, and it captured that. And I don't think you have that in all third places. I mean, you saw a little bit of that in the comments about the Irvine Farmers Market. Let's look at another third place. Here you've got a Starbucks coffee on this corner and another one on this corner. So you've got sort of a mass proliferation of Starbucks. This happens to be in Vancouver, Canada. And actually the CEO of Starbucks began his business with the idea of third places. He wanted Starbucks to be the third places to American communities and communities all over the world. So he had read Oldenburg and knew about that concept. Question is, can places that are so numerous, and they're on just about every other block, if you go down Broadway in New York, you'll find a Starbucks on just about every block. Is that sort of cookie-cutter design? Does that detract at all from the quality of the third place, or can it still be a pretty good third place, whether there's thousands of them in a particular state or not? Yeah. So Amber's saying that we've had quite a diversification of third places where you have some that are designed for older women trying to pick up single guys, maybe younger guys. So there's quite a variety out there. But how many of you think that Starbucks is a pretty good third place, or does it depend on the individual Starbucks? So it still provides a third place, and even if there's a lot of them. And in Irvine, we don't have a lot, but we've got our Pete's and we've got our Starbucks, so we have to kind of, be grateful for what we got. But you can see some communities have a very elaborated menu of third places that people can choose from, and that makes the city very interesting and lively. Oldenburg's theory has gotten a little complicated in the sense that with virtuality and people bringing their wired lives into places, we have these hybrid places now. It's not just a first, second, third, but you've got first, second combinations, second, third combinations. So here you've got a Starbucks where people are working pretty much individually. They're not interacting with strangers or friends so much, but they're focusing on their their work. So that's sort of a second place combined with a third place. Here you've got a home office situation combining a second place and a first place. So homes no longer are that refuge away from the world. They're a hub where you do all kinds of things in the same space. They have to be wired. They have to have Wi-Fi. So these are ways in which these places are changing. And Oldenburg didn't talk about other kinds of settings. He didn't talk about open space and public parks so much as some of the anti-density designers did. He was more focused on these built environments where people can congregate and socialize. But a very interesting theory about what makes spaces better scaled and more interesting. Now on Thursday, we're going to talk about William White's book, and this is one of the paperback texts for this book, where he did a very intensive study of social spaces in New York City by doing time-lapse photography and seeing where people went, where they congregated, what spaces were effective, which ones weren't. And he found that these different dimensions here were key to having a vibrant social space in a large urban center like Manhattan. And I won't go into all of these. We're going to see actually a film on Thursday that provides some really interesting examples of how he discovered these elements, from sittable space to proportion of women and groups in the area, how natural elements like sun, trees, water are woven into urban spaces, food vendors, even undesirables, he calls them. Spaces often need some undesirables. As long as they're not hurting anybody and acting out, it kind of makes the space more interesting. And then something he calls triangulation. And triangulation is bringing people together around some unusual event, like you have a juggler or a mime that's doing something, and suddenly people are drawn together and they're looking at that almost as if they're not strangers. They're more familiar with each other. They're laughing. They're taking pictures. And here you've got street ping pong in a city. And you can do a lot of things to make triangulation. For example, let's show a quick video of the piano spaces one first. So this is one example where in Los Angeles, New York City, a lot of cities around the world, they're putting pianos out in the open urban centers, Times Square, and just inviting people to come up. The piano says, "Play me, I'm yours." And people can sit down and play Chopin and Beethoven and boogie and whatever they want to do. So this is an example. All right, so let's show the piano stairs. There's one more short one. You got to see this. It's pretty interesting, too. So these are ways to create this triangulation that William White's talking about. So when you read his chapter, look for these kind of elements. So this is another example of what a city has done to kind of make something a little more interesting, more vibrant, human scale. So if you Google fun theory, you'll see some more examples of that. Just quickly, I just got a couple more slides. I just want to show these so you're ready to read William White's chapters, okay? So next slide. Triangulation. We talked about how to get people together, get them interacting. These are some other examples. In Melbourne, Australia, they have these bike sharing stations where people come to those stations, they start talking, and they meet each other that way. Here in San Francisco, near Ghirardelli, you've got these mimes doing their thing. So processes by which some stimulus provides a link between people and prompts strangers to talk with each other as though they weren't strangers. And sitting space, sittable space, it comes up again and again in terms of how to make a community walkable, how to make it a vibrant social space. So this is something that William White emphasizes a lot in his work. And one other thing I'd like you to look for when you read William White, he talks about translating some of these design findings and behavioral findings into very prescriptive principles. So here he's saying from his research, he discovered that if you can provide 1 linear foot of sitting space for every 30 square feet of plaza, that makes the plaza a much more sociable space. So we're going to see some other examples where designers have actually tried to translate very specifically and precisely design guidelines and principles based on behavioral research, such as the kind of findings we've talked about in this class. So, yeah, enjoy White, and we'll take a look at his film on Thursday.